The US Marine Corps repeatedly fought large Viet Cong formations during the second half of 1965, and their most notable opponent was the 1st Viet Cong Regiment. Significant casualties were inflicted on the regiment in August during Operation Starlight, which was an attempt to secure the area around Chu Lai. But Harvest Moon would reveal a number of problems with Marine Corps operations. On November 17th, 3 Viet Cong battalions overran the South Vietnamese outpost at HIệp Duc, 40 kilometers west of Tam Kỳ. HIệp Duc was positioned where the Nguy Loc Sun Basin, the Western Highland region, became the Quay Sun Valley. A strategic crossroads, the area was a gateway for communist forces moving from the Western Mountains into the coastal plains. Viet Cong formations and supplies could move through the region undetected during the monsoon season, and the loss of HIệp Duc allowed the communists unrestricted movement throughout the year. 2 ARVN battalions were lifted into HIệp Duc to retake the position, using Marine UH-34D helicopters. However, fire from the VC stopped the landings after only 1 ARVN company had been landed. The company was then about to be surrounded, but Marine F-4B Phantoms and A-4 Skyhawks softened up the landing zones, allowing the rest of the ARVN troops to be landed. The South Vietnamese then retook HIệp Duc on November 19th after several days of difficult fighting, losing 33 men killed with 73 wounded. However, a few days later, the 18th NVA Regiment and the 45th Viet Cong Heavy Weapons Battalion attacked the ARVN outpost at Tao Chu, and with ARVN forces stretched thin, I Corps Commander General Nguyen Chong Thi and Marine General Walt decided to abandon HIệp Duc and use their limited forces to reinforce Tao Chu. This was a symptom of the general problem facing US and South Vietnamese commanders. The Communists could attack various targets at the same time, forcing 3rd Marine Amphibious Force and I Corps to spread their units through the area, limiting their ability to concentrate forces. American forces were stretched thin as they attempted to pacify population centres, secure the countryside, and destroy main force Viet Cong. The need to abandon HIệp Duc prompted Military Assistance Command Vietnam to order 3rd MAF to execute a spoiling attack against the 1st Viet Cong Regiment in the Quay Sun Valley. The defeat of the regiment in August was less decisive than it seemed at the time, as it demonstrated a remarkable ability to sustain heavy casualties and rebuild itself with North Vietnamese regulars infiltrated into the south. The operation, codenamed Harvest Moon, would use Marine Corps and South Vietnamese battalions. The operation's primary objectives were to prevent the Communists from taking Quay Sun, to allow the South Vietnamese to re-establish their lines of communication in the valley, and to wear down the VC in the area. Westmoreland believed that if the Americans and South Vietnamese didn't have the numbers to retake the outpost, they could at least use their manoeuvrability and firepower in a search and destroy sweep that would target Communist combat forces and disrupt their plans in the valley. Harvest Moon would take place in a rough triangle. The north point of the triangle was the town of Tung Binh, the site of the ARVN command post. The eastern boundary was Route 1, and 17 kilometers to the south was Tam Kỳ. The second side of the triangle was formed by routes 534 and 535, which proceeded southwest from Route 1, and the third side was formed by the Cong River and Route 586. The Cong River flowed southeast from HIệp Duc. The area within the triangle was a valley of rice paddies, the high ground mostly defined by tangled thick brush and rainforest. Hills range from 200 to 500 meters in height, the larger hills covered with trees that reached as high as 100 feet tall. 3 prominent areas defined the Quay Sun Valley. The first commanded the southwest approach along Route 534. The second was defined by a narrow canal between HIệp Duc and the wider valley to the east, and a ring of hills in the southern part of the valley formed the third. Most of the villages stood at the base of the mountains, and these, along with hedgerows and cane and pine stands, provided cover for the VC to maneuver throughout the valley. The Viet Cong cut roads and destroyed bridges to obstruct approaches into the valley. They also made extensive use of natural features and a network of natural and man-made caves and tunnels, using moderate and large-sized underground rooms for storage, protection and living quarters. The operation would fall during the northeast monsoon season, and consequently low cloud cover and rain would be a constant obstacle for air operations. 9 of the 11 days of the operation had marginal or bad weather. During marginal weather, cloud ceilings were 1,200 feet or lower, and visibility was restricted to 1 to 3 miles. Intelligence reports confirmed 1st Viet Cong Regiment was in the Quay Son Valley, but the size and composition of the regiment was still uncertain. The Harvest Moon Intelligence Summary estimated the regiment's strength to be between 1,800 and 2,150 personnel in 4 battalions, the 40th, 45th, 60th and 90th. There were also other VC units in the area, including the 49th, 70th, 80th and Chu Dung battalions. The battalions had strengths between 350 and 500. Estimated total VC strength was 4,700, with the bulk of VC forces positioned south of Route 534. Viet Cong forces in the valley were a mix of main force and guerrilla units. Harvest Moon would involve 2 multi-battalion formations, 2nd ARVN Division's 5th Regiment and a Provisional Marine Force, Task Force Delta. Task Force Delta was created from various battalions and elements of his own headquarters by General Walt, Commander 3rd MAF. Colonel Oscar F. Petros, commanding 7th Marines, recalled that most of the Delta staff had just come to Vietnam. The individuals were competent, he observed, but there seemed to me to be too many newcomers to start right out in a combined operation with the ARVN. A board of investigation convened by Walt later concluded this approach had led to confusion and instead recommended using a regimental staff in future operations, rather than creating an ad hoc staff. Delta, commanded by Brigadier General Melvin D. Henderson, comprised 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, led by Lieutenant Colonel Leon N. Utter, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Joshua W. Dorsey III, and a Provisional Artillery Battalion led by Lieutenant Colonel Joris J. Snyder. Smaller supporting units included Company C, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, Company C, 3rd Engineer Battalion, and the ground combat element of the Special Landing Force of 7th Fleet, which would act as a floating reserve. The 2 Delta battalions were from different regiments and divisions. 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines came from 1st Marine Division, while 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines came from 3rd Marine Division. 3-3 was a composite of the battalion's headquarters and service company and its Company L. It also included Companies E and G from 2nd Battalion 9th Marines and Company G from 2nd Battalion 4th Marines. The Provisional Artillery Battalion was also task organised and consisted of batteries from the 11th and 12th Marines. These units were separated when the operation was set to start. 3-3 was at Da Nang, while 2-7 was at Chu Lai, making face-to-face communication between battalion commanders during the planning phase of the operation impossible. Henderson completed planning with Brigadier General Huang Xuan Lam, commanding general of 2nd ARVN Division, on December 7th. D-Day was set for the 8th, and the operational order was then distributed to relevant commands. The man leading this force, General Henderson, was an experienced Marine. He had taken part in some of the toughest fighting in World War II, including Saipan and Iwo Jima, and had earned the Bronze Star with Combat V for service as Executive Officer of the 4th Engineer Battalion at Iwo Jima. He had been Assistant Chief of Staff G4 at Headquarters Marine Corps before deploying to Okinawa in 1965, and following that tour, Lieutenant General Leonard F. Chapman Jr., Chief of Staff to the Commandant, stated that Henderson was fully capable of handling any assignment, command or staff, with distinction. Henderson arrived at 3rd Marine Division in the summer of 1965, and as the Commanding General of 3rd Marine Division Rear, he oversaw the transfer of the division's headquarters and units from Okinawa to 3rd MAF in South Vietnam. He also served as Commanding General for Fleet Marine Force, 7th Fleet, overseeing the creation of the SLF as a floating reserve for 3rd MAF. With the majority of 3rd Marine Division now in South Vietnam, Henderson joined the division at Da Nang in August, serving as one of the 2 assistant division commanders. As a consequence, although his experience was primarily as an engineer and logistician, Henderson was familiar with combat and had experience commanding large formations, and he had worked with the SLF. He also had the confidence of his superiors, and General Walt had previously remarked that Henderson was a very energetic, hard-driving, can-do type of officer. However, Henderson lacked experience commanding large units in combat. This would be the first time he had led a multi-battalion force in battle. But many of these senior Marines with 3rd MAF also had little experience commanding large formations in combat at this early stage of the war. His headquarters was formed around officers from 3rd Marine Division headquarters, who had little experience working with each other, a hindrance in light of the operation's complexity. The 5th ARVN Regiment would move from Tung Binh southwest into the Quay Son Valley and toward HIệp Duc on the 8th, a movement planners expected would draw the 1st Viet Cong Regiment out to battle. The next day, 2 battalions from Task Force Delta, 2nd Battalion 7th Marines from Tong Ki and 3rd Battalion 3rd Marines from Huong Xuan would land behind the VC. The ARVN Regiment would then be the anvil on which the Task Force Delta hammer would smash the VC. Delta's operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph E. Sullivan, was blunt when describing the role of the ARVN. They were the bait. The 3rd Marine Division had conducted helicopter assaults before, particularly Operation Starlight, but those operations were usually near the coast and had been carried out in coordination with an amphibious landing. Harvest Moon, however, would take place 32 kilometers inland, in a heavily populated area thick with rice paddies. Lifting 2 battalions into the Quay Son Valley would be difficult enough. There were only a few areas that were a safe distance from villages and hills that could be full of Viet Cong. The Marine and ARVN forces would operate within range of Delta's Provisional Artillery Battalion. They could also depend on close air support from 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. Supplies would be transported via Route 1 to a logistics support area at Tung Binh, north of the area of operations. Helicopters would then lift supplies into the battlefield as required. A company from 3rd Engineer Battalion would work to keep the route open during the operation. The plan, in the words of a Headquarters Pacific Air Forces study, left much to be desired. A complex operation, it required coordination between a range of command levels and close cooperation between ground and air units, but the operation order sacrificed detail in favour of conciseness. There were 3 basic and interrelated problems that undermined the operation: the ad hoc nature of Task Force Delta, an obsession with secrecy among planners that obstructed clear communication between units, and the weakness of the South Vietnamese military. Part of the logistics plan for Harvest Moon involved a convoy of 200 trucks moving down Route 1 from Da Nang to the logistics support area at Tung Binh. The convoy would then unload and continue to Chu Lai, where it would reload with ammunition and rations and return to Tung Binh. There was entirely too much secrecy during the planning, 7th Marines Commander Colonel Petros later noted. Secrecy to the extent that units involved in supply and similar support were unaware of their role unless they found out by accident. The only Marine force available to escort the convoy was the 7th Marines, and Petros first learned of the mission from Lieutenant Colonel Utter, commander of 2-7, which was part of Task Force Delta. And despite the fact a convoy had never been run between Da Nang and Chu Lai, the logistics commander at Chu Lai was unaware of the role his post would play in the coming operation. Petros believed these issues could only be attributed to the lack of experience in Vietnam of the Harvest Moon planners. The Special Landing Force would be used as a tactical reserve. However, its ground component, BLT 2nd Battalion 1st Marines, led by Lieutenant Colonel Hannafin, had conducted 5 amphibious raids against the Viet Cong between September and December, and it had started to redeploy out of theatre on December 6th. The command group, Companies F and G, and attached artillery, armour and Amtrak units were aboard the USS Valley Forge and USS Monticello and were headed to Okinawa, Japan, while Companies E and H were aboard the USS Montrose and detoured to Manila in the Philippines to collect landing craft. During the night of December 6th, word was received from General Walt that the SLF would be needed for Harvest Moon. The Valley Forge and Monticello turned back to South Vietnam and would be in position for operations by the morning of December 8th, but Montrose would not arrive in time for D-Day. BLT-21 would therefore participate in the operation without two of its rifle companies. The operation's organisational and command issues were made worse by an overriding concern with security. The only instructions issued to the floating force in the order dated December 7th was that control of the SLF would fall to Delta once the landing force arrived in the objective area. The battalion landing team was to be prepared to land by helicopter to reinforce, block, counterattack, or exploit gains by Task Force Delta. The order issued to the SLF on December 9th was even more vague, and this lack of information hindered the SLF's ability to prepare for deployment. The later investigation board remarked that, since no coordinated planning or briefing was conducted by principal units concerned with the Hello Assault of 2nd Battalion 1st Marines, the key decision-making personnel were not in possession of sufficient information to make sound decisions, nor the means to disseminate their decisions once they were made to all who needed to know. The emphasis on secrecy was in part driven by concerns that the ARVN had been infiltrated by Viet Cong spies. As a consequence, planners denied the 2nd ARVN Division Air Liaison Officer access to planning sessions. The 5th ARVN Regiment commander was told his men would be conducting a sweep and clear mission along Highway 1 around Lee Calm. He was only informed of his regiment's real mission on December 7th. Colonel Sullivan remarked that General T warned us on 4 December not to discuss this operation with any of the ARVN except for a select few in his own headquarters and that of General Lambs. Sullivan continued, the fact that at 13:30, 8 December, the 11th ARVN Ranger Battalion walked into a prepared ambush is prima facie evidence that if Colonel Qua was kept in the dark, the commander of the 1st Viet Cong Regiment was not. General Walt was an imposing presence. A combat veteran who had earned 2 Navy Crosses, the Silver Star with Combat V, the Bronze Star with Combat V, and a Purple Heart in World War II and Korea, he was an infantryman to the core and had the reputation of being a 3-star grunt. Intended as a positive observation, this also underlined Walt's tendency to hover over subordinates. Working relationships between 3rd MAF commanders and ARVN I Corps were cordial, but Walt had a low opinion of General T's South Vietnamese forces. In August, Walt had only informed T and the commander of the 2nd ARVN Division when carrying out Operation Starlight. He had kept details of the operation from the rest of I Corps. Marine leaders generally found commanders of regular South Vietnamese forces unreliable and politicised. T had participated in several attempted coups against the Saigon government, and he was effectively a warlord in South Vietnam's 5 northern provinces. T also underrated the ability of the Marines to conduct effective counterinsurgency operations. During the spring of 1965, he had tried to isolate 3rd MAF's area of operations to Da Nang. But regardless of the issues with the ARVN as a combat force, the success of Harvest Moon largely depended on the effectiveness of Brigadier General Hoang Xuan Lam's 2nd ARVN Division. Task Force Delta's operations officer observed, the 5th ARVN Regiment was to make and hold contact with the 1st VC Regiment after luring them out of the hills. But if the ARVN could not fix the Viet Cong, they would have complete freedom of manoeuvre and could then refuse contact with the Marines, continuing to hold HIệp Duc and the entrance to the Nguy Loc Sun Basin. The 5th ARVN Regiment left Tung Binh at 08:30 on December 8th, moving southwest on Route 534 towards HIệp Duc. The regiment was composed of 1st Battalion and 11th Ranger Battalion, which also included a 4-man artillery forward observer team from Battery C, 1st Battalion, 12th Marines. American advisors also served alongside the Vietnamese. And at 1000, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines began its motor march from Chu Lai to Tam Kỳ. The SLF commanders, Colonel John R. Burnett, Lieutenant Colonel Hannafin, and Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn B. Porter, departed USS Valley Forge, which had just arrived off Chulai that morning, around the same time, arriving at 3rd MAF headquarters in Da Nang to receive orders. Henderson and Walt gave the SLF commander the Harvest Moon operation order, but its actual mission was not specified. Burnett was simply told to be prepared to land. He was also told to assign a liaison officer to Task Force Delta headquarters. Burnett then returned to Valley Forge with Porter and Hannafin, where they waited for orders. At 13:30, the advance of 5th ARVN toward HIapplDuc was disrupted when the 70th Viet Cong Battalion ambushed the 11th Rangers. The ambush took place 5.5 kilometers east of Quay Son, near Hill 43. The VC Battalion, under the operational control of 1st Viet Cong Regiment, attacked from the northwest and southwest. In less than 15 minutes in a devastating engagement, the ARVN Battalion lost nearly a third of its strength. An advisor with the Rangers stated, "They hit us with rockets, mortars, machine guns, small arms, everything. They attacked in mass and hit us from all sides." The Rangers withdrew 1,200 metres to the north, while 1st Battalion 5th Regiment tried to assist with supporting fires. At 14:34, Marine Medium Helicopter Squadron 161 began lifting 1st Battalion 6th ARVN Regiment from Tom Key to reinforce the Rangers. Providing prompt close air support proved difficult, as 3 members of the Marine Forward Observer Team were dead, and contact between the airborne and ground direct air support centres was lost. An Air Force Forward Air Controller then took command of airborne operations in the area and directed 47 Air Force and Marine sorties. But the sorties were directed against pre-planned targets, and the strikes actually obstructed 1st Battalion in its attempt to reach the Rangers. The VC broke contact at 14:45 and headed north, which allowed the ARVN battalions to regroup, stabilise their position and recover casualties. Harvest Moon was over before it had begun. The Task Force Delta Operations Officer, Colonel Sullivan, recalled that any reasonable chance of Delta achieving its objective was emasculated. The Viet Cong had retained control of the area around Quay Son, and this required the airlifting of Marine reinforcements. Unfortunately, when the Viet Cong struck the Rangers, 2-7 was still moving to Tom Key and would not arrive there until 15:15, while 3-3 was still in Da Nang. Henderson was therefore limited in the reinforcements he could dispatch. With 1st Battalion 6th ARVN, he also ordered Battery M, 3rd Battalion 11th Marines, to move its towed 155mm howitzers south to Tung Bin, and he used helicopters to lift 2 ARVN 105mm howitzers to Quay Son. The 3rd Battalion 3rd Marines departed Da Nang at 0500 the next morning, and moved south along Route 1 to the logistics support area. With Henderson's Marines still too far away to help, 5th ARVN was attacked for a second time at 0645, this time by the 60th and 80th Viet Cong battalions. The regiment's commander was killed, and at 0702 the perimeter was broken and overrun, the ARVN retreating 6,000 metres to the east. An Air Force Bird Dog observation aircraft directed the retreating South Vietnamese from ambushes and toward 1st Battalion 6th Regiment. The retreat was disorderly, however, and spotting the remnants of the regiment, 50 men led by a corporal, retreating directly toward a VC position, the Air Force Forward Air Controller in the Bird Dog directed strikes from Marine aircraft and an Air Force AC-47 Spooky gunship. These strikes inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Cong. A second attack failed to dislodge 1st Battalion 6th ARVN from its position, and at noon 1st Battalion 5th ARVN's American advisor led the battalion's survivors up Hill 43. The situation was dire for the ARVN. 2 of the 3 battalions committed by ARVN I Corps had been shattered by VC ambushes, and the regimental headquarters had been destroyed. Henderson didn't learn about the second attack until shortly after arriving at the ARVN command post at Tung Bin at 0800. He then boarded a helicopter and proceeded to Tom Key. There he ordered Lieutenant Colonel Utter to insert his 2-7 behind the VC and rescue what was left of 1st Battalion 5th ARVN. The designated landing zone, Spruce, was southwest of Quay Son and almost 9 kilometers west of the ARVN position. The move began at 1000 as HMM 161 and HMM 361 started to lift the Marine Battalion, the initial elements arriving at 1040. The lift was complete by 1330, and over the next 6 hours the battalion's rifle companies secured the landing zone, then advanced 4,000 metres to the east, securing a hill mass by 1645. As 27 was entering the battlefield, Henderson established a command post at Quai Son. There he ordered 3 to relieve 5th ARVN. The battalion had been en route via motor march from Da Nang since 0500, and it arrived at the logistic support area at 1030. HMM 261 began lifting the battalion at 1400 to a landing zone at 2,500 metres southeast of Hill 43. The initial elements, Battalion Headquarters, Company L, and 2 platoons from Company E, 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, landed and began to move west at 1500, 3 making contact with 1st Battalion, 5th ARVN. With the battalion continuing its advance, at 1700 Company L turned north across a rice paddy and began to move toward high ground. As it started this movement, the VC opened fire on the company's rear from the north, northwest and west. The leader of 3rd Platoon, Staff Sergeant Robert F. Moe, recalled that, "We had moved within 1,000 metres of our actual objective, and it seemed like the whole area just erupted with Viet Cong fire. They had us with machine gun fire, automatic weapons fire, and hit us with 60mm mortars and 81mm mortars, which was quite effective and quite accurate on our company." Taking fire from 3 sides, Moe was determined to move his platoon from the rice paddy and onto high ground. With 2nd Platoon providing a base of fire, Moe directed his 2 squads into a favourable position and then assaulted the approximately 100 VC holding the position. After a fight that lasted about an hour and a half, 3rd Platoon established a strong position on the hill and Marine helicopters began evacuating casualties. Moe's action stopped the VC's attempt to destroy Company L and what remained of 1st Battalion, 5th ARVN, and earned him the Navy Cross. With 3 having suffered 11 killed and 17 wounded in action, the battle ended at 1830, 75 VC killed in action through Company L's counterattack, artillery fire and close air support from 1st MAR. The battalion then established a perimeter for the night on the high ground seized by Company L and prepared to continue to Hill 43 the next morning. Task Force Delta had started to move its headquarters to Quai Son during the morning of December 9th, completing the move by 1045. The Task Force's Provisional Artillery Battalion also established a perimeter 300 metres south of the village and set up the 105mm howitzers from Battery F, 2nd Battalion, 12th Marines. That afternoon, Henderson ordered his executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel William F. Doler, to move the Delta command post from its position inside the village to the artillery position due to security concerns. Doler later recalled that Henderson was concerned about the position of the command post and the possibility of it being overrun by VC elements. However, Doler had selected the site for the command post himself, regarding it as relatively secure. But Henderson's concerns were not unfounded. The surprise attack on the ARVN Rangers had proved the VC were closer to Quai Son than had been believed. The command post had also received what was believed to have been 81mm mortar fire, although Doler thought it might have been friendly fire. The move south started at 1700. With the staff and equipment to establish forward and rear command posts, continuity was maintained between the old position in Quai Son and the new command post to the south. But because Doler had assumed the command post would be in buildings in Quai Son, the task force didn't have enough tents to set up a new command post in the artillery perimeter, which created a crowded and limited space. Major Fred E. Clark Jr., the task force communications officer, stated the displacement was accomplished amid considerable confusion. Marginal radio communications between Delta and 3rd Marine Division's headquarters added to the confusion. Major Clark noted that communications between the AN/PRC-47 battery-operated sets in the command post and Da Nang and the logistic support area were garbled and drowned out by static. At 2200, Henderson ordered the command post batteries shut down for security reasons, leaving the radios inoperable and preventing any repair work from being carried out. Despite these problems, the command post continued to function, and Henderson maintained contact with his battalions to the south. The decision to commit the Special Landing Force was made while Henderson was moving his command post. It's unclear whether Henderson or Walt made the decision. Because of the disruption at the command post, the SLF received its notices from other sources within Task Force Delta and 3rd MAF. The plan was to use the SLF Battalion landing team as a blocking force. Delta's 2 battalions were converging on 5th ARVN's initial objectives along Route 534 on the night of December 9th, and the SLF, landing south of the route, was intended to prevent VC in the area from withdrawing south. The constant movements of the Task Force command post meant that the SLF didn't receive clear instructions during the hours before landing, and BLT-21 staff didn't receive detailed plans until 13:30 on December 9th. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas E. Gleason, the SLF operations officer, left Valley Forge at 1400 for the Task Force Delta command post, where he reported as SLF liaison officer. That afternoon, Henderson told his air officer, Lieutenant Colonel William R. Quinn, that he would probably commit BLT-21 sometime the next day, but Gleason was briefed on the plan at 1650 by Dola and Walt. Walt wanted 2 companies to land at first light, 1.6 kilometers south of Route 534, at a position between 27 and 33. Gleason reminded him that the SLF had been reduced by 2 companies, but while Walt recognized this shortcoming, he wanted all available elements of the battalion landing team to be committed. At 1800, Gleason ordered a subordinate to return to the Valley Forge to inform Colonel Burnett of the planned landing. Surprised that Walt wanted to commit the reduced battalion, BLT-21 commander Lieutenant Colonel Hannifin dispatched a flash message to 3rd MAF requesting detailed instructions and asking for confirmation of the commanding general's orders. Radio problems, however, disrupted direct communications between Valley Forge and Da Nang, and Hannifin would not receive an official response until the afternoon of the next day, at which point his battalion was already committed. That evening, Hannifin knew he would take his battalion into a landing site south of Route 534 after first light. However, neither he nor SLF Commander Burnett knew the exact time, landing zone location, or enemy situation. Captain Ray E. Levan Jr., Battalion Intelligence Officer, recalled, "We still had no idea when, where or how we would be committed." At the same time, Walt was ordering 3rd MAF Operations Officer, Colonel Edwin H. Simmons, to draft a message to Combined Task Force 76, ordering it to prepare to land at the SLF. The message was vague, indicating the landing should take place before 0800. The exact time and place would be dictated by Henderson, but it's unknown whether Simmons knew Henderson was at that time shutting down his command post. The SLF didn't receive the order until 0600, when Burnett met with Walt and Simmons. At 0100, Delta's operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan, told Henderson the command post should return to its original location inside the village. The absence of adequate blackout working space and crowded condition militated against remaining there. We knew that an infantry company was to be committed in the morning. I recommended that we move back to the Quaison village area itself, lift in the 2nd battery of 105mm howitzers, and wrap the infantry company around the entire position. This move, Sullivan argued, would also strengthen Delta's command and control functions, as the command post would be closer to the task force manoeuvring elements. Sullivan discussed this with Henderson for about an hour, and at 0200 Henderson decided to move again, this time 9 kilometers northeast to the logistic support area, moving his command post further away from his manoeuvre elements. Sullivan informed Dola of the decision at 0430, sparking a heated discussion between Dola and Henderson. Sullivan and Dola believed the staff opposed the move, and a strong recommendation was made to remain at Quaison. However, Henderson's decision stood, and preparations were made for the move. The most significant drawback of this decision was a loss of command and control function as the SLF was about to make its assault. At 0530, BLT-21 still had no idea when or where it would land. Task Force Delta hadn't even conducted aerial reconnaissance to find a suitable landing zone. At 0600 on December 10th, Colonel Burnett left Valley Forge to meet Henderson, assuming he was at the logistics support area, but instead he found Walt and Simmons there. Simmons then learned that Burnett had not received the landing order he had drafted the previous evening. Unable to reach Henderson by radio, Simmons, Burnett and several SLF staff officers boarded 2 helicopters and flew to Quay Sun to find him. Ironically, Henderson was en route to the logistics support area, and returning there, Simmons and Burnett finally found the Task Force Delta commander. Henderson, Simmons and Burnett then departed the support area in 2 helicopters and headed south to scout possible landing zones for BLT-21. The flight's lead pilot, Major James E. Gillis, testified later that he orbited the area between 1,000 and 2,000 feet for about 10 minutes, at some time between 0900 and 0930. Due to heavy cloud cover, it would have been difficult to gain solid intelligence even at 1,000 feet. Visibility was difficult above 1,200 feet. The flight concentrated on an area between Route 534 and 2 prominent hills to the south, Hills 403 and 407, selecting an island in a sea of rice paddies 3 kilometers south of Route 534 and just north of Hill 407. Simmons noted no unusual activity in the area, but Burnett was less confident, and he was frustrated that he had no information on the enemy situation or the specific mission for BLT-21. Returning to the logistics support area, Henderson ordered Burnett to insert BLT-21 north of Hill 407 at 10:10. The battalion mission would be to seize the landing zone, organise a defensive blocking position, and to be prepared to move in the direction of BLT-27 or BLT-33. Henderson informed his air officer, Lieutenant Colonel Quinn, of the planned landing time. When Quinn complained that 2 hours were required to have the aircraft on station, Henderson responded that the landing team had to be brought in as quickly as possible to relieve the ARVN, but he did push the landing hour back to 10:30. Quinn then approached Major Robert D. Purcell, the operations officer of Marine Observation Squadron 6, at 1000. That morning, Purcell had taken an aircraft section to the logistics support area from Da Nang to serve as a tactical air control system. He had been there for 10 minutes when Quinn informed him he would be Tactical Air Coordinator airborne for the BLT-21 landing. Purcell was shocked at this. I said that we can't possibly get down there to the landing zone, which I had not seen, recon the thing, check it out, and bring aircraft in at 10:30. With the task of landing 2 companies in less than 30 minutes, Purcell worked to gather information quickly, but Quinn was unable to provide many details. He could not tell Purcell how many aircraft were available for landing zone prep, what their call signs were, how many men would be landing, the call sign of the lead helicopter, or how many helicopters would actually be landing. All Purcell knew was the landing zone coordinates, and that the landing would take place in 25 minutes at 10:30. Quinn told him to get the rest of the information from the Direct Air Support Centre when he was airborne. Purcell's flight of UH-1Es took off, and he immediately contacted the DASC, but it was unable to provide any more information. Colonel Michael R. Yunk, operations officer for 1st MOR, arrived at the logistics support area as Purcell was leaving. He informed Quinn that adequate strike aircraft were not on station to prepare the landing zone, but Quinn replied that the landing would take place regardless. Yunk then took to the air, with the aim of assisting Purcell as the Airborne Tactical Air Coordinator. The Task Force Delta Command Post lacked control and communications between 0830 and 1130 as it displaced to the logistics support area. Lieutenant Colonel Dola monitored the movement as helicopters transported equipment and personnel from Quay Sun to the north. Dola then took a flight to the support area at 0920, where he was approached by Walt, who immediately asked Dola what was going on. Although 2/3 of the command post had been set up at the new location, Walt then ordered Dola to move the post back to Quay Sun. This was the 4th move in one day, and was a sign Walt was losing faith in Henderson and his ability to lead Task Force Delta. Burnett arrived aboard Valley Forge at 0930 and gave Lieutenant Colonel Hannafin the order to land his battalion at the coordinates near Hill 407. Companies E and H were out of range aboard USS Montrose, and the landing team would also go into battle without its attached units. The SLF helicopter commander, Lieutenant Colonel Porter, asked for information on escort aircraft and approach lanes, but neither Hanifin or Burnett knew any details. The first wave of BLT-21 lifted off from Valley Forge at 10:12. 22 UH-34Ds carrying 2 platoons and the command element from Company F escorted by UH-1Es. As the assault force lifted off, Colonel Young contacted the DASC and requested preparatory airstrikes on the landing zone. However, the DASC was informed that because the aircraft was still having ordnance loaded, it would be at least an hour before they would arrive on station. Quinn then decided to delay the landing. He called the DASC and ordered them to reroute the UH-34Ds and UH-1Es to the logistics support area, where they would wait for the preparatory strikes to take place. The helicopters had arrived at the support area by 10:25, and they would wait there for more than 30 minutes. At 1100, F-4B Phantoms from Marine Aircraft Group 11 and A-4 Skyhawks from MAG 12 arrived on station and began strafing the landing zone. Young looked down at the landing zone as the airstrikes began. He spotted a small hamlet near the zone, and women and children were visible in the streets and adjoining fields. The hamlet had been missed during the morning reconnaissance flights, and, concerned civilians would be caught in the bombing and assault, Young ordered the strike shifted to the south and west. He also made the decision to move the landing zone 600 metres to the west to an area of muddy rice paddies and dikes. Satisfied that the area was quiet, Young ordered the strike aircraft to break off, marked the new landing zone with yellow smoke, and cleared the helicopters to land. The first wave of helicopters with BLT-21 left the logistics support area at 1100 and proceeded to the landing zone. The Marines realised they were in a fight as they approached the area. Colonel Porter reported that, "We were receiving fire on our approach, and everybody pushed in there pretty fast." He also remembered seeing Viet Cong running parallel to the helicopters as they descended to the landing zone. As the assault began, Colonel Young was wounded, Major Purcell taking over his position as Tactical Air Officer. The VC response to the landing was clear evidence of the failure of the preparatory bombardment to neutralise the enemy. Marine Corps doctrine treated the landing zone as a landing beach, an area to be saturated with bombs, rockets and missiles launched from fixed-wing airframes. In comparison, the US Army used helicopter gunships to escort utility and transport helicopters. Marines with Vietnam experience had questioned Headquarters Marine Corps reluctance to develop gunships. The character of the VC and a large number of villages in the countryside suggested the use of helicopters for both landing zone preparation and close air support. Westmoreland would later comment that, proud of an admittedly excellent close support tactical air system, the Marines long resisted the helicopter gunship. He also observed that their self-confidence also apparently made them reluctant to ask for help, so that often I had almost to force them to accept US Army support. Company F disembarked under heavy fire. Captain Robert C. Gregor, the battalion artillery liaison officer, described the landing. Both gunners in my plane opened fire and appeared to be firing in every direction. The fire was coming from a tree line 300 to 500 metres to the south and east at the base of Hill 407. Within minutes, both platoon leaders and Company F commanding officer, Captain James E. Page, were wounded. Page's wounds were so severe he was pronounced dead, though he would survive his injuries. The battalion intelligence officer, Captain Ray E. Levan Jr., observed, "We noticed there were about 100 Marines scattered over the rice paddy and pinned down as we were. We guessed these Marines were the first wave of F Company." 10 minutes after pinning Company F with rifle fire, the VC began laying down mortar rounds, and within half an hour the two platoons had suffered 8 to 9 killed in action and 24 to 25 wounded. Hanifin later remarked that, "After that they were pretty well pinned down and they kept down. They were unable to advance or withdraw." Captain Levan, assuming command of the company, decided to hold there and await orders from the battalion commander. He redeployed his platoons to strengthen the company's position and ensure the remaining machine gun was put into action. The Marine Company also began firing its 3.5-inch rockets at VC machine gun positions, and the company's forward air controller also maintained contact with the tactical air coordinator, securing support from 1st Mars A4s and F4s. Hanifin, on board the Valley Forge, didn't know the assault force had been rerouted to the logistic support area. He assumed the landing had taken place at 10:30 and was still waiting for the helicopters to return for the second wave at 1100. When the helicopters did return to Valley Forge, Hanifin listened to their radio traffic, and he then learned that Company F was being shot up and receiving mortar fire. He realised his battalion would be chewed up if he didn't insert his follow-on forces immediately. Hanifin assembled 2 more platoons and his command group and departed the Valley Forge at 11:45. Believing any more landings in the current landing zone would have been disastrous, Major Purcell decided to move the landing zone to a location where he had observed elements of 2-7 as it had continued its advance to the east. By 1100, 2-7 had swept most of the area north of BLT-21. Purcell found the best high ground outside VC mortar range, marked the area with smoke, and informed the incoming UH-34Ds of the new landing zone. The VC opened fire on the 2nd Assault Force. Hanifin recalled that, "On the way in, I was looking out the window of the helicopter. I'd put one of the helmets on, we were getting mortar fire, and I saw the landing zone. Went on by the landing zone, did a 180, and started heading east again, and then dropped in." Hanifin spotted Marines as he disembarked, but he didn't recognise them. He had landed in the middle of Company E-27, 2,500 metres from his Company F. When he tried to raise his company on the radio, he found his transmissions jammed by Marine aircraft. The Harvest Moon operation order included a detailed communications annex, specifying which frequencies would be assigned to each unit, but aviation assets in the area used frequencies not designated in the order. Helicopters orbiting were also broadcasting with so much power they were causing interference with ground communications. The Company F forward air controller was able to reach Hanifin, and the company gunnery sergeant, Joseph Furman, could then provide him with the first clear briefing on the company's status. Company F was pinned down in a rice paddy 1,200 metres west and south of its designated landing zone, and it had approximately 11 men killed in action and 30 to 40 wounded. The company commander had also been wounded. The time was 12:30. Hanifin then sent a message to Task Force Delta headquarters. He would begin assembling the elements of the second wave and would then move to relieve Company F. But Hanifin was not sending his intentions to Henderson. Around 1100, when the first wave of BLT-21 was leaving the logistics support area, Henderson was engaged in a private conversation with Walt at Quai Sun. After a 30-minute conversation, Walt approached Dola and ordered him to take over Delta. He tasked him with bringing the battalions together in a mutually supporting position by nightfall, and to be prepared to continue the attack the next day. With little sense of what was happening on the battlefield, due to the command post moving to 3 different locations during the morning, Dola immediately boarded a helicopter and flew south to find Hanifin. Henderson had failed to conduct effective command and control of Delta, and this confusion was partly responsible for the ambush of Company F-21 by the VC at Hill 407. Sullivan later noted that what these movements did to staff cohesion and the resultant all but total lack of support for and control of 3 Marine battalions, one of which being in a desperate fight, is best left to the imagination. It's unclear why Henderson wanted to move the command post. His staff opposed the decision, but he was convinced Quai Sun was not safe, despite a lack of evidence to support his conviction. At 0930, 3-3, after advancing west all morning, reached Hill 43. There they found about 40 survivors of 5th ARVN, including the body of the regiment's commander, as they searched the area for any dead and wounded remaining on the hill. The battalion then continued west toward Hill 63 as helicopters lifted the dead and wounded out. The hill had been one of the ARVN regiment's original objectives. When Henderson was relieved, BLT-21 was scattered, with 1 company pinned down at the base of Hill 407. Dola decided to consolidate his 3 battalions around Hill 63. He ordered 2-7 to send companies E and G southeast to reinforce 2-1 around Hill 407. The situation was not improving for Company F. The company's second in command, First Lieutenant Barry N. Beck, had landed with the second wave, and at 1300 he was able to contact his unit. The radio operator informed him that the company commander and 1st and 2nd platoon leaders had been wounded. 1st platoon had taken heavy casualties, but he could not give Beck an accurate count. Beck concluded, "I received the picture from the radio operator that the company was stretched out in the paddies in small groups and that things were badly disorganised." Hannafin's Marines received extremely heavy fire from the base of Hill 407 as they advanced. Brigadier General Platt, 3rd Marine Division's 2nd Assistant Division Commander, arrived to assume command of Task Force Delta at 14:15. Like Henderson, Platt was also a combat veteran, and before arriving in Vietnam in November, he had been the commanding officer of the basic school at Quantico, Virginia. Platt continued Dollar's attempts to relieve pressure on Company F, attaching Company E-27 to BLT-21 and giving Hannafin 2 companies to reach Company F. And under strong air cover, Companies E and G-27 proceeded south toward Cum La, Company G on the left and Company E on the right, the goal to insert themselves between the VC at Hill 407 and Company F. However, the advance was poorly coordinated, and in the face of heavy enemy fire, Company G pulled back. A gap then developed between the two companies, which the VC quickly exploited, assaulting Company E with withering enfilade fire. Company E sustained heavy casualties, wounded and dying Marines scattered over a wide area, but it continued to inch forward, eventually closing with the VC and becoming locked in a close quarters struggle. This had the effect of drawing the VC away from Company F, which allowed Hannafin to extricate the company and its casualties, and by 1730 the three companies had linked up and prepared defensive positions for the night. At 1800 helicopters arrived to begin evacuating wounded Marines. But small arms fire from Hill 407 continued to be a threat, and the Marines had to wait for nightfall to move most of the wounded to the battalion's command post. Companies F and G, BLT-21, and Companies E and G-27, also under Hannafin's command, waited through the night as enemy 12.7mm automatic weapons fire and driving rain prevented evacuation of the wounded. The remainder of the battalion's casualties would not be lifted out until the early morning hours from 0400. Company F-21 had 10 men killed and 22 wounded, while Company E-27 had 8 men killed and 31 wounded. December 10th was the costliest day for Marines during Harvest Moon, and it also saw the collapse of cooperation between the ARVN and US Marines. As BLT-21 was landing, General T, I Corps commander, was withdrawing his remaining units from the combined operation. He was bitter at what he perceived to be a slow response from the Americans to relieve his unit, and now South Vietnamese units would operate independently from Task Force Delta. The original operational scheme had been abandoned, and rather than work together with the Americans to trap the Viet Cong as had been planned, the ARVN would operate north and east of Quai Son, the Marines to the south. Harvest Moon had become a basic search and destroy operation. Brigadier General Platt was boarding a Huey as dawn broke on December 11th. He found no signs of VC activity around Hill 407, and at 0800 he met with Hannafin, ordering him to move his battalion toward the high ground northeast of Hill 407 and to then attack southwest along its eastern slope. The battalion moved out at 10:30, and 2 hours later it would be reinforced by its 2 remaining companies as the Montrose arrived off the coast that evening. With BLT-21 moving south, 2-7, led by Colonel Utter, seized Hill 407, securing the summit at 1600. The VC had indeed withdrawn. Patrolling east and west of Hill 63, 3-3 encountered little VC activity, other than an abandoned network of caves and tunnels to the west of the hill. The region around Quai Son secured by 3 Marine battalions, Platt concluded that the 1st Viet Cong Regiment had withdrawn south to the Phuoc Ha Valley. The Phuoc Ha Valley was a complex of hills that had been the centre of VC operations for some time. Any operations Platt hoped to conduct there would depend upon the heavy use of helicopters to transport Marines and supplies. Visiting Delta headquarters, Brigadier General William E. Dupuy suggested Platt use Air Force B-52s to soften up the valley. An arc light would devastate VC positions as preparation for the Marine assault south. On the morning of December 12th, B-52s struck the valley. Sergeant Rick A. Lee, a fireteam leader with Company G-27, remembered that it was still raining. You couldn't see more than 400 to 500 yards. You couldn't see the B-52s, you couldn't hear them, but we could see the bombs bursting, not more than a quarter mile away from us. 2 days of strikes were conducted, and with the bombardment completed, Platt deployed Delta into the valley, dividing his force in two. First, 2-7 was sent deep into the valley, southeast to the Kong River. The battalion would then advance east to Tom Key. Meanwhile, 3-3 and BLT-21 would advance along the north of the valley, to the east and northwest. The overall mission was to find VC forces and have them expose themselves to attack. The weather conditions would make it a difficult march for all Marines involved. A persistent mist was punctuated with heavy rainfall, making everything wet. Sergeant Lee recalled that, "Sometimes at night we slept in 6 inches of water." Because of the nature of the terrain, most of the advance east would be carried out on narrow, muddy trails and through damp paddies. This would make trench foot a problem for the Marine units. The 3 battalions participating in Harvest Moon had been in South Vietnam for at least 3 months, and many of the Marines were walking in worn boots that rotted quickly, chafed when wet, and needed to be replaced often. Lacking the protection of adequate footwear, many of the Marines had soaked, dirty feet, which were vulnerable to infection. Staff Sergeant Moe, Company L 3-3 noted that, "You put new socks on your feet dry, 5 minutes later they're just as wet as the pair you took off." Sergeant Lee also commented that his unit couldn't keep our socks dry, couldn't keep our gear dry. It was hard to keep our magazines clean, hard to keep your rifle clean. I wish I'd put more socks in my pack. Moe recalled that, "We had to stay on the trooper and make him get his boots off and get his feet out in the air for as much time as he could." In the most severe cases, trench foot would require a Marine to be airlifted for immediate medical attention. On December 13th, the second day of B-52 strikes, Platt replaced the battered E Company 2-7 with Company H, 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines. Utter's battalion then moved west along a dirt road to secure the South Vietnamese outpost at VIểt. Company F seized the high ground to the north, Company G the high ground to the east, and Company H occupied the town that evening. Company H-27 maintained its positions on Hill 407. The outpost secured, the battalion was resupplied and intelligence was acquired on VC to the south. The battalion also helped evacuate dead and wounded ARVN soldiers. The next day, 2-7 conducted a helicopter lift south to the Kong River. Following airstrikes on the landing zone, Companies F and G landed shortly before noon, facing sporadic 12.7mm machine gun fire from fleeing VC. The companies quickly secured the landing zone and were reinforced by Company H-29. Defensive positions were then established along high ground that overlooked a ferry crossing they believed was used by the VC. As 2-7 moved deep into the Phuoc Ha Valley, Delta's 2 other platoons began to move east and south. BLT-21 had been patrolling south along the eastern slopes of Hill 407 since December 12th, pausing for 2 days to avoid the B-52 strikes on the 12th and 13th, encountering little enemy activity. Meanwhile, 3-3 continued its advance southeast into the north of the valley, assessing damage inflicted by the B-52s. The battalion discovered evidence of how secure and well provisioned the VC had been during the operation, in caves filled with uniforms, cots, blankets and medical supplies, underscoring the uncomfortable fact that the communists were sleeping with a dry roof over their heads while the Marines endured the monsoon season in muddy foxholes. Task Force Delta continued its advance over the next 3 days. 2-7 moved east from the ferry crossing over the Kong River and along the river's north bank, discovering a VC medical station. BLT-21 reached the southern boundary of the area devastated by the arc lights on December 15th, then pivoted northeast to link up with 3-3. As 2-1 crossed the ridge of hills separating the two formations at 11:30 on December 16th, it ran into 40 to 50 Viet Cong, exchanging fire until the VC broke contact. The battalion continued its patrol over the next 2 days, exiting the valley complex on December 18th when it was lifted by helicopter to Phu Bai. 3-3 exited the complex between December 17th and 18th, and was lifted by helicopter to the logistic support area. However, 2-7 encountered a more difficult march. The battalion didn't meet significant enemy activity when it began to move out from the ferry crossing site on December 15th. It continued its march on December 18th, planning to reach Zone High by nightfall. The village of Key Fu, 8 kilometers west of Tom Key, was eerily quiet as the battalion passed through it. A fireteam leader recalled that men were absent and women were huddling in corners, clutching their children. The battalion had been receiving sniper fire throughout the day, but Utter didn't believe this was anything more than harassment. He was also confident that his patrols, 500 to 700 meters to his flanks, would spot any possible ambushes. But the battalion was not in the best state to deal with such an ambush. It had been moving on foot for 32 kilometers along a narrow paddy dyke, in an area that was damp and muddy. More than 50 of the battalion's Marines had been lifted out of the area with trench foot on the previous day. Company G was on point, followed by Company F, the two lead companies in a V formation, followed by the Headquarters and Service Company, with Company H, 2-9, forming the rear of the column. The area around Key Fu was largely composed of rice paddies, small villages and hedgerows. A low ridge to the south, no higher than 30 meters, commanded the western approach to the village. By 13:30, about half the battalion had passed through Key Fu, when Companies F and G came under heavy fire from machine guns and recoilless rifles. Utter continued to believe this was only harassing fire, and he ordered Company G to turn south and use the battalion's 81mm mortars to clear the road. He also ordered Company F to replace Company G on point. However, Company G was now reporting it was receiving mortar fire itself. Utter's misunderstanding placed the battalion at great risk. The attack was actually a large-scale ambush by the 80th Viet Cong Battalion, with the aim of destroying the Marine Battalion. A gap emerged between the two advanced companies and the lightly armed Headquarters and Service Company. To exploit this gap, two VC companies struck from north and south of the road, aiming to exploit the gap, split the battalion in two and destroy each half in detail. But the battalion stood its ground, and it not only survived the ambush, it also inflicted heavy casualties on the VC. Utter was with Company F, and he lost contact with the rest of the battalion when his radio operators were killed. Lieutenant Nicholas H. Gross Jr., commander of the Headquarters and Service Company, described the intensity of the VC fire. For the first couple of hours we were pinned down. Most of the casualties I took were in the head and shoulders, just from firing back over the rice paddies. The gap between Company F and the Headquarters and Service Company had widened so much that a small number of VC set up a 12.7mm machine gun in the opening and raked the beleaguered company with enfilade fire. Hand-to-hand fighting occurred and pistol fire was exchanged in some places. Recognizing the dangerous situation, Gross ordered runners to establish contact with Utter and Company F and get the company to close the gap. However, the two runners were both killed, and Gross himself then attempted to make contact. His clothing and canteen were punctured by bullets, but he did reach the Company F commander, who then moved his command to the west. Returning to his company with the lead elements of Company F, Gross began to evacuate wounded Marines, and rallying his men, he helped cover the withdrawal of wounded that could move without assistance. His actions earned him the Navy Cross. Under orders from Utter, Company F quickly turned around and headed back to Key Fu. Utter was also able to use the battalion tactical net to relay a request for supporting fire to Task Force Delta's Provisional Artillery Units. Battery M, 4th Battalion, 11th Marines, then opened fire with its 155mm howitzers on Viet Cong forces south of the battalion. This allowed the Marines to regain the initiative, and the arrival of Company F also stopped a VC effort to set up a machine gun position inside the battalion's area. The company then set up a platoon facing south, deploying its remaining platoons to the right of the VC positions, where they inflicted heavy casualties on the Communists. The Headquarters and Service Company, using flamethrowers, destroyed two machine gun positions. As the Marines turned the fight around Key Fu in their favour, Company H-29 was ambushed at the rear of the battalion column. The company commander, Captain Paul L. Gormley Jr., and his radio operator Lance Corporal Robert J. Wilkins, were quickly killed by a 57mm recoilless rifle. First Lieutenant Harvey C. Barnum, an artillery observer from 2nd Battalion, 12th Marines, then took command of the company. I ran 50 yards, picked the company commander up, and he died in my arms. At that time I went from being a forward observer to being the company commander. To establish command of the company, Barnum strapped the fallen radio operator's ANPRC-25 radio to his back, the long antenna immediately making him a prime target for snipers. But Barnum had much to do. He had to restore command and control of Company H, evacuate the dead and wounded, and he had to break out of the ambush and link up with the rest of the battalion. Barnum contacted Utter and, ordered to regroup with the rest of the battalion, he responded that he would first need to evacuate his wounded before breaking out. Company H held off the VC for 4 hours as the Marines worked to secure a landing zone from which the wounded could be evacuated. 3 UH-1Es soon arrived to provide close air support, Barnum firing white phosphorus rockets to light up targets. When the 3.5 ran out of ammunition, I stood up there and was pointing with my arms outstretched at the targets, and the chopper pilots flew down the axis of my arms. While engaging the ambush south of the road, a Company H platoon secured the landing zone to the north, and 2 UH-34s then began to evacuate the wounded. The fighting lasted for between 6 and 7 hours. Then, with the wounded lifted out, and with ammunition low, Company H began the difficult process of fighting toward the east to rejoin the battalion. Company H began the difficult process of fighting toward the east to rejoin the battalion, using fighting rushes and close support from helicopters to break through one squad at a time. The entire company had regrouped with the battalion by the evening. Barnum then took account of the wounded. That was the hard part. I didn't know those gallant warriors. It was very emotional that night, sitting with the company gunny, looking at the dog tags. The battalion had 14 men killed in action and 73 wounded. 9 of the casualties were radio operators. Radio operators, platoon leaders and company commanders were usually the first targets during VC ambushes. The bodies of 104 Viet Cong were found on the battlefield, killed by 2-7 and supporting artillery. The action at Key Phu was the last major engagement of Operation Harvest Moon, as, over the next 2 days, 2-7 continued its move east to Tam Key. As the Marines were leaving the valley, on December 7th, 3rd Battalion 5th ARVN withdrew from HIapplE Duc toward Viet An, with local officials and 100 to 150 refugees, arriving at Quay Sun on December 18th. The 3 Task Force Delta battalions had completed their moves out of the Harvest Moon area of operations by December 19th, and the operation officially ended on December 20th. The Marine Corps concluded that at least 407 Viet Cong had been killed during Harvest Moon. The ARVN had lost 108 men killed in action, while the Marines had lost 56 men. This was a marked contrast with Starlight, when 3rd MAF had inflicted twice as many VC casualties while losing 51 Marines. The 1st Viet Cong regiments had learned its lesson, and by drawing the Marines inland, they limited the impact of their amphibious capabilities and could engage them where and when they chose. Harvest Moon was declared a success at the time. A significant number of Viet Cong had been killed compared to Marine Corps losses. The amphibious landing of a Marine battalion had blocked enemy elements from escaping a trap, and the value of organic close air support had been demonstrated. However, those assertions must be qualified. The landing of BLT-21 was confused, and it did not succeed in preventing Viet Cong forces from withdrawing south. There was also a lack of coordination between ground forces and fixed-wing and rotary-wing elements throughout the operation. A board of inquiry was later convened by General Walt to examine the landing of BLT-21 and why it had been so confused. Most of the conclusions drawn by the board centered on the lack of clear communications between General Henderson and the landing forces, a problem caused by his decision to repeatedly move his command post during the opening phase of Harvest Moon. But the plan itself was faulty. The planners constructed an elaborate set-piece battle, based on the assumption that 1st Viet Cong Regiment would not understand that Task Force Delta was attempting to force a confrontation in which it could bring to bear its advantages in mobility and firepower. and crucially, the prepared ambush of ARVN forces on December 8th and the losses inflicted changed the operation from an elaborate ambush ultimately into a search for the 1st Viet Cong Regiment in an attempt to engage it. Planning between Marine Corps and South Vietnamese forces was superficial, despite Harvest Moon being the largest Allied operation in I Corps to date. The greatest issue was the large difference in combat effectiveness between Task Force Delta and the 5th ARVN Regiment. General Walt had a low opinion of the ARVN's ability, and the inability of 5th ARVN Regiment to conduct independent operations in the Quay Sun Valley confirmed that. Delta and 3rd MAF also failed to adequately coordinate with 2nd Air Division and other US Air Force units. Soon after Harvest Moon, General Westmoreland, MacV, requested that 2nd Air Division examine the possible advantage of placing Marine Tactical Air under its direction, which sparked an inter-service feud that dragged into 1968. But there was much to be positive about. Task Force Delta, once it had come under the direction of Brigadier General Platt, proved itself to be a highly mobile combat force, capable of operating deep in Viet Cong territory. The Marines also demonstrated their tactical superiority over their VC opponents. And the landing of BLT-21 on December 10th demonstrated the ability of Marine air officers to think on their feet. The 1st MOR also provided effective close air support when the weather and lines of communication were clear. The Wing's helicopters could also be depended upon to evacuate wounded Marines. The Task Force's Provisional Artillery Battalion provided effective fire support throughout the operation. The 3rd MAF planners had hoped Harvest Moon would repeat Starlight's success in wearing the 1st Viet Cong Regiment down, but the results were disappointing.